everybody. I don't think we actually would need the microphones, but it's good for the recording. So, hello, thank you for coming. My name is Gianluca, and I'm going to moderate the introduction and introduce our speaker. So, our event today, How Much is Too Much? Substance Abuse and Addiction in Young Adulthood. And we have a speaker that is, I think, more than qualified to talk about this topic and give us some insights. His name is Boris Quednow. He studied psychology and pharmacy at the University of Bonn, and he did his dissertation with consequences related to ecstasy at the University of Bochum, and worked as a research assistant also at the University of Bonn. Now he's associate professor for experimental and clinical pharmacopsychology at the Department of Psychiatry, Psychotherapy and Psychosomatics of the Psychiatric University Hospital Zurich. Very focused on the psyche. And his main research interests are behavioral neurotoxicology and neuroplasticity of substance use, as well as the neuropsychopharmacology of disturbed brain function in psychiatric disorders, particularly schizophrenia and addiction. So this is one of his main fields, addiction. Yeah, without further ado, give you the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation to this interesting event. First of all, I would like to say the topic I speak about today is not, let's say, at the heart of my daily research business. As it was said before, I'm more interested directly on the neurobiological and neuropsychological consequences of drug use. So we try to understand what changes if somebody uses chronically substances. Yeah? What changes in the brain, what changes in emotions, in cognitions, and in the social behavior of subjects. However, today I give you a talk which more broadly introduces and describes addiction as a phenomenon, also for you to help to justify your own substance use or to weight your own substance use or the substance use of your environment a bit better. So first of all, the United Nations estimate that, that's not surprising, that cannabis is still the most common used illegal drug in the world. For sure, the most common non-illegal would be alcohol and tobacco, but from the illegal part, at least in most of the world, cannabis is still the lead, followed by opioids, amphetamines, cocaine, and then ecstasy. The picture in Switzerland and in Europe I will describe a bit later. That's slightly different, but we come to this some minutes later. And as you see here, I already said this, the drugs are not everywhere the same, that are at least most frequently used. So Europe is a typical cocaine, amphetamine, and cannabis market, while other regions of the world, like the US has become or has developed epidemic opioid use. So first, the use of prescription opioids has risen, and as a consequence later they got a new heroin wave. But this is not the case, at least so far, in Europe. And also there are some other regions like the Far East, where sometimes completely different drugs play a huge role, which are not that a problem, for example, in Switzerland or the rest of Europe, like ketamine. Yeah? So if we look for drug use epidemiology, we always have to look for the region where which is targeted. In fact, so substance use matters specifically if a substance use disorder or a dependence has developed. So it is estimated that the substance use disorders belong to the top 20 of the leading causes of global burden of disease. So in females, drug use disorders are placed at the rank of 18th, and this is far higher in the males. So this already gives us a glimpse that drug use may be primarily a male problem, but we come to that later again. So how is the situation in Europe in general? So also in Europe, cannabis is the most common used drug. It is estimated that there are about 20 or a bit more million users that have used cannabis at least once in the last year. So that's one estimator of drug use for the European Union and the last year prevalence. This rate is higher in young adults. Yeah, you know, drugs are more used by young people, and the prevalence is at least twice as high as in the full age range. Here we have a last year prevalence of about 15 to 16% of the young adults, of the youth and young adults that have used cannabis at least once in the last year. The second drug actually in Europe, and this is different to the global perspective, is already cocaine, followed by MDMA and amphetamines. And if you look at the prevalence rates, they are far lower than, for example, cannabis use. Machen wir es so. How is the situation in Switzerland? In Europe, there we have a kind of yearly monitoring across the European countries in the EU. Not every country in the EU monitors substance use on a annual base, but so there is at least an annual drug report by the EMCDDA, the European Behörde, the European agency who's monitoring drug use in the EU. So, but the Switzerland does not take part in this EU project of drug monitoring. So we have to look what are the governmental numbers in Switzerland published. And interestingly, the last numbers published, official numbers, are from 2016, so they are pretty old. And interestingly, if you look here for cannabis use, the cannabis last year prevalence is more or less comparable with the numbers from the last year in the EU. 8 years ago, it was a bit higher than in the EU, but cannabis use has risen in the last 10 to 15 years in Europe. But if you look for the cocaine numbers, amphetamine, MDMA, maybe I go back a bit, then the numbers are lower. Yeah, at least the numbers estimated by the Ministry of Health in Switzerland. I have to say these are numbers from a telephone interview. So from a randomized telephone interview, you might have chosen a call center is calling you and you are asked for your substance use by an unknown person at the telephone. So how reliable are these numbers? And actually most addiction experts from Switzerland, they are in doubt that these numbers are true. And there were investigations of wastewater, you may have heard this. And if we are looking for the wastewater, Swiss cities are amongst the highest in entire Europe. And this is, by the way, also the case for MDMA. So that these are even newer numbers. What you also see that MDMA use has strongly risen. So in the late 2010 years. So these numbers suggest that likely the drug use is not below the European average that what the numbers of the Ministry of Health has suggested. In fact, we did a study here in Zurich. Now 4 years ago, we asked 1,200 20-year-old people who participated in a longitudinal cohort study, the Z-Proso study, and we asked them also for the last year prevalence of drug use. And what you see here is very high numbers, unexpectedly high numbers. If this would work here, yeah. You see that in this survey, almost 60% said that they have used cannabis at least once in the last year. More than 10% used ecstasy and cocaine. And also opioids. Opioids are drugs of higher harm potential. Codeine, so cough medication, which is sold in Switzerland for free in pharmacies, so without prescription. More than 10%, and even opioid painkillers, almost 5%. And these numbers, we were very surprised. Maybe you, the younger generation, is less surprised, but these numbers were surprisingly high for us. If we look for gender differences, so usually I said the perspective of an addiction psychologist like me is, men use more drugs and they use more severe, or they have more severe drug use patterns. But if we look here, in fact, men are using more, so they have a higher prevalence rate. But the gap between the sexes is far lower than expected. So also ecstasy is was used by about 10% of the females. Also cocaine was used by about 8% of the females. This was also surprising for us. There are some drugs where no significant difference was observed, but or there were also drugs like opioid painkillers where females had a higher prevalence than males. So this was really unexpected for us. We have also asked the people when they started drug use, so what we call the age of onset of drug use. And for cannabis, this is pretty early in Zurich. The median is between 15 and 16, so that means half of the people, of the cannabis users, started their cannabis use before the age of 15 and a half, and the other half later, at least in a cohort of 20-year-olds. You see that cocaine and MDMA and also amphetamines, the use is started later, so the median is here 18. But again, who used these drugs started, the half of them started before the age of 18. Yeah. Hallucinogens have an even higher median age of onset, and for opioids and benzodiazepines, it's quite different. It's these drugs were in this generation not that common. I think the young generation who is now between 15 and 20, they would have a earlier age of onset, specifically for benzodiazepines, because, for example, Xanax is very hip at the moment in young students. So what we did on top in this study is we collected hair samples. self-reports of drug use in the questionnaire, even in a longitudinal cohort study, where the people are very familiar with the study personnel and so on, it was not clear how reliable these self-reports are. Therefore, we used, in collaboration here with a toxicological, forensic toxicologists, hair analysis to estimate that. And we used 3 centimeters, and 3 centimeters reflect 3 months of drug use, so a quarter of a year about. We also asked on top, again, the use of drugs in the last 3 months. And we compared both numbers, and here we are. So one problem that arises is you can detect THC in the hair, but only at very high concentrations. So in contrast to stimulant drugs or opioids or also benzodiazepines and many psychiatric drugs, for example, where we sometimes can detect single uses in 3 months. Yeah, this is not possible with cannabis. Cannabis use can only be detected if it is somewhere between weekly and daily use. So several times a week likely also induces a positive test here. If you only use it once a week or less, we will not see it in the hair. So therefore, the left side here, we have the self-report of weekly or daily cannabis use. It's about 18%, and the positive THC positive hair samples were around 14%. So the daily users, the self-report is a little bit lower, about 11 to 12%, and you see this reflects more or less well what we already have known, that we can detect weekly to daily use with this method. And the numbers are quite reliable. So if you are using cannabis, the people were likely, they told us the truth. But if we look for ecstasy and cocaine, also codeine, the hair numbers were higher, about 30 to 40% across the drugs. Yeah, so the self-report underestimated the true drug use in this sample. So again, this means in this cohort here of 1,020-year-olds from a representative cohort study, that 12% have used ecstasy in the last 3 months, and almost 10% cocaine in the last 3 months. And this is an incredible number for an addiction psychologist like me, because if we think back to the official numbers, this is far, far, far more. Yeah, maybe not surprising you because you observe your environment likely very with high attention. But for us, this was really not expected. So looking again for gender differences, I make it short here. The difference between self-report and objective measurement is usually less in females than in males. So either females told us more the true consumption, or they had a better memory. Yeah, we don't know. But that's interesting. So the bias was lower in females. So what we see in these hair samples, and what is also known, that most of the drug users use it in a controlled way. Most of the drug users who use drugs regularly will not become addicted or dependent in their life. And the holy grail of addiction research is who is becoming dependent. So why start people using drugs, and why get some of the people in the end addicted and others not? Yeah. What we know, and this is a new, let's say, perspective on substance use that is now developing more and more in this addiction research area, is that we look on substance use as instrumental use. So people use these drugs for specific purposes, and these purposes are usually, at least in the beginning, positive for the persons, for the affected individuals. Here are different motives or instrumentalizations of drug use that are listed. So the most common is likely feeling better in any way, or getting high is maybe an extreme here, but just feeling better. Maybe some use drugs also for cognitive enhancement, specifically stimulant drugs, or for vigilance enhancement and counteracting fatigue. Cannabis is not so ideal here, alcohol as well, but again, stimulants are the drugs used for this. Improvement of social interaction, facilitating sexual contact. So you are in the Ausgang and you use drugs maybe to get to know a partner, for example. Enhancement of physical attractiveness, that's what the authors listed. I never understood it actually, what they meant. Do they mean I'm more attractive, or do they mean the other one gets maybe less unattractive by the drug use? I don't know. Then also important motive is simply curiosity and sensation seeking new experiences, or also coping with physical and psychological stress. And finally, another facet of that, self-medication of psychiatric symptoms. So what is now, how does a psychiatrist define drug dependence or substance dependence or substance addiction? So many people use these both terms in German, Abhängigkeit und Sucht, in English, dependence and addiction. They use these terms as synonyms, vice versa in a way. But in fact, drug dependence means physical dependence. So if the body gets dependent. That means that the drug is, if you use it chronically, once necessary for normal function of the organism. These drugs usually also develop tolerance. And if the drug is not longer in the body, withdrawal symptoms arise. And interestingly, also non-psychoactive drugs or drugs that do not produce a high can induce dependence, like antidepressants. This would also be the case for several psychiatric medications. Here we know alcohol, nicotine, all opioids, benzodiazepines, barbiturates, GHB, liquid ecstasy, they all can induce a physical dependence. In contrast, drug addiction or Sucht usually means psychological dependence. And then here you might think, okay, this is easier, this is less severe, but this is in fact not the case. Here, a major factor is the motivational strength of the substance. And this results in the end in a compulsive relapsing drug use despite the knowledge of negative consequences, and although there is no physical dependence. And this is usually triggered by craving symptoms, so the urge to use a drug in response to contextual cues. So it's a learning mechanism. You get conditioned on the drug. And these are usually all stimulants, including cocaine and amphetamines. cannabis is not so clear if it belongs to the first or the second class. And for ecstasy and hallucinogens, there are experts saying there is no addiction from these substances. And actually in psychiatric care, these substances do not play a big role. Yeah, a very low number of people seeks help because of only MDMA addiction or only hallucinogen addiction. So these are substances of at least low addictive power. Interestingly, there is in the new classification criteria published by the American Association of Psychiatrists, they dropped both terms. Yeah, they say we don't speak longer about addiction, we don't speak longer about dependence, it's all substance use disorder. And we drop these names for anti-stigmatization reasons. They also say don't use abuse or misuse of drugs anymore. This is all stigmatizing. Just speak about use of drugs. However, when we look for the classification criteria of the WHO for drug dependence, then you see this is there are 6 criteria, and these criteria have to be fulfilled for a certain time period during 1 year. Yeah, they should at least they should occur together within the last 12 months, and if you fulfill more than 3 criteria, then you get the diagnosis of dependence. And you see, this can be compulsive drug use, difficulties in control substance taking, withdrawal signs, tolerance, neglect of alternative pleasures of interest, also neglect of social contacts, for example, and using the drug despite the known negative consequences, and so on. So 3 of them would be enough to fulfill the criteria of drug dependence. So what you also see is a purely phenomenological diagnosis. Yeah? We don't have any biomarker, any biological test, any medical imaging technique that informs us if somebody has a addiction, dependence, or whatsoever or not. As I said, the American Psychiatric Association, they have a different approach now. They say we are just speaking about a substance use disorder, and this can be light, moderate, or severe. They have 11 criteria, and they say if you fulfill at least 2 of them in a given year, then you start already with a light substance use disorder. So what previously was meant as abuse, for example, would be now termed as a light substance use disorder, and a severe substance use disorder likely is more or less the same like a dependence diagnosis earlier. So the addictive potential of drugs is not the same across the drugs. So there are drugs with a high addictive potential and drugs with a low addictive potential. And the most addictive substance that we know is nicotine. Yeah, so we know that about 1/3 of the smokers get a nicotine use disorder, nicotine dependence, as you like, once in the lifetime. Yeah, 1/3 will develop nicotine dependence. Heroin, it's about 1/4 of the users. It's not every user, as maybe your mother and father have told you. If you once take heroin, you are dependent for the rest of your life. That's not true. But the number is high. Yeah, a quarter is still high. And this is also true for cocaine and also methamphetamine, which is not included here. But these stimulants also have a high addictive potential. For cocaine, it's estimated between 15 and 22% of the people who will develop cocaine dependence during lifetime. And actually, cocaine and also methamphetamine are the drugs with the fastest development of dependence. So 5 to 6% of the users develop dependence already in the first year of use. This is far more than, for example, for alcohol. Most other drugs, actually, they have a risk of about 10%. So 1 in 10 users will develop a problem with this. This is true for cannabis, at least for the total age range. This is true for alcohol, for stimulants other than cocaine, so methylphenidate, Ritalin, or amphetamine. Also for anxiolytic drugs like benzodiazepines and so on. What's also different between drug is the harm that is caused by the drugs. And here you see a listing which differentiates between harm to yourself if you take the drug and harm to your social environment. And here the most harming drug is alcohol. Yeah, for sure this has something to do with the frequency of use or with the availability of the drug. There's a question.
How is that measured?
Actually, that's a very good question. This is a Delphi survey in addiction experts. Yeah. For example, in UK addiction experts, the UK addiction experts say that ecstasy has a very low risk. I wouldn't agree here. Yeah, I did a lot of research with ecstasy users, and I wouldn't place it on top, but I wouldn't also place it as low as placed here. Yeah, but this is just the opinion. This is not based on empirical facts, let's say. Yeah, nevertheless, I think this reflects which drugs are at the moment a problem in psychiatry. Yeah, how many users do they see, and how hardly are they affected? There's another factor modulating the addiction risk. It's age, and the problem is that especially young people are at higher risk of getting addicted. Yeah, this graph shows the percent of each age group with the first time dependence, and you see between 15 and 25, the risk is much higher than during the rest of the life. This also contributes to the fact that, for example, teenage cannabis users have a much higher risk than adult cannabis users. And this is, again, elevated in daily users. And if you then think about that there are many daily teenage cannabis users, they have the highest risk you can imagine. Yeah. So there are moderators of the addictive potential. Another problem is that early substance use, and this is a very good or a very elaborated study, a national multi-cohort study with more than 5,000 people. They looked for signs of substance use disorder during adolescence and in later life. It's a longitudinal study. And they clearly showed that young people using, for example, medical prescription drugs like methylphenidate or opioid painkillers, or which show any kind of substance use disorder symptoms already in adolescence, they have a much higher risk in later life to develop a full or a more severe substance use disorder. This has also been shown specifically for cannabis use disorder. This is interesting because these were already adult users, and they were investigated twice with an interval of 4 to 5 years. And cannabis users at the first measurement had a 6-fold increased risk suffering from any kind of substance use disorder 5 to 6 years later. So it doesn't matter if so most of them developed cannabis use disorders. The risk was about 10-fold, but you have also elevated risk, for example, to develop alcohol use disorder. So you may have heard from the problem or from the concept of a gateway drug. This has now made an evolution in that way that we don't think that somebody who starts using cannabis is using heroin once later. Yeah, so that's not true in that way. But from the epidemiological standpoint, we know that many users of one drug start to use other drugs later in life. But it's not a linear relationship, but they obviously learn to instrumentalize one drug, and this elevates the risk to learn also the effects of other drugs, or this is lowering the threshold to use other drugs, likely. Yeah, there are other risk factors for drug addiction, and usually we look at the biological layer, on the genetic layer. There seems to be a genetic contribution to addiction. It's not that big compared to other psychiatric disorders. And we know that there's this very strong environmental influence on drug addiction. So how early you use, how the availability of a drug is, how the cost of drugs is, and if you are affected by any kind of psychiatric problems. For example, childhood trauma or chaotic home situations and child abuse and so on. But also parents' use, parents' attitudes, peer influences, and so on. We know that this has all a big impact on drug use. There are different theories how drug use usually develops, and this is a very influential one, the opponent process theory. However, this is likely more a theory targeting drugs inducing physical dependence. Yeah? A good explanation is simply nicotine. So usually somebody uses a drug for having a positive affective state. Ich habe hier einen Pointer. So the drug induces a positive affective state, and once the drug effect fades out, sometimes you get a slightly negative effect afterwards, a catarrh or a withdrawal symptom on the next day, or sometimes also not. So if you start using the drug more and more and more and more, the positive effects are diminished more and more, and the negative effects are increased. And there is one point where you simply use the drug to diminish negative effects, and where you more or less have no positive effects anymore. And again, smoking is a good example here. Most severe smokers don't smoke for pleasure anymore. Usually they don't like smoking anymore, but they have to smoke, because if they are not smoking, they are coming into a very unpleasurable negative affective state. Yeah? So they have to smoke to decrease this negative effect. However, this is, for example, not that well explaining stimulant addiction. Yeah, in stimulant addiction, you usually don't have these long-term negative effects. You have the crash, for example. In cocaine use, if you have a binge use experience of cocaine, if you're using several grams on one weekend, a line after a line, and then you're stopping cocaine, then you can develop very strong negative effects. But if they are once away, after some hours, usually, then there is no negative affective state anymore. Yeah. Therefore, another theory has developed, the incentive sensitization model, and this model is interesting. It is based on the model before, but it differentiates two states: the wanting state and the liking state. Yeah, I want a drug and I like a drug, and that's again for smoking interesting because smoking, if you develop dependence, you don't like the drug anymore so much, but you want it more and more. And they said wanting is mediated by the neurotransmitter dopamine, and liking is mainly mediated by the endogenous opioid system. And they also tried in animal models to separate specific hotspots in the reward system for wanting and liking. This was very interesting. However, in humans, it is very hard to really differentiate wanting and liking. Yeah, to really measure wanting and liking. We tried that once, but yeah, I can tell you it's not that easy. Another influential theory is coming from Nora Volkow and colleagues, because they focus on another aspect of addiction. They clearly focus, or they clearly conceptualize addiction at the form of pathological learning and memory. They say, usually if I start using a drug, I have control over my drug use, and the reward of the drug and the drive to take the drug is not that big. And if I once have taken the drug, I have also a memory of the drug effect. However, if I use the drug more and more, the reward of the drug and the drive to seek this reward gets more and more important. The memory on the drug effect gets more and more important, but the control gets weakened more and more. And she said, so control are usually associated with the functions of the prefrontal cortex, the motivation and the drive to use a drug are associated with the orbitofrontal cortex, and learning and memory with the hippocampus and the amygdala, and reward and salience with the nucleus accumbens, so the core structures of the human reward system. She later also differentiated different stages. So the first, we have the positive reinforcement of the drug, and this is mainly mediated by the activation of the reward system by dopamine and also endogenous opioids. And in this stage, stimulus response habit learning is enhanced. That means also, if I, for example, take cocaine, then the environment gets more and more important for me and is associated with the drug use. This is what we think is associative learning of the context cues, and this later plays an important role for relapse. Then we have the withdrawal state, or the negative effect state, where other brain structures like the amygdala are getting important. This is inducing stress, which again is associated with the activity of the HPA axis, so with the cortisol release, for example, or the adrenaline release, and also some opioids which are mediating negative affective states like dynorphin. In this stage, you should have reduced endogenous opioids, and this leads to a kind of negative reinforcement. So again, like in the opponent process theory, I'm seeking the drug to avoid these negative symptoms. And finally, and this is likely mostly true for the stimulant drugs, if I'm now getting into an environment where I usually use the drug, for example, I'm using the drug already in the Zukunft, in the club. Yeah, not I as an example. Yeah, I haven't been there for a long time actually. And then this context association activates the memory system, the drug memory, and now the organism is expecting a drug effect. And if this drug effect is not coming, withdrawal symptoms or the urge to use the drug is getting stronger and stronger. And at that stage, disrupted prefrontal control is important. So I can't handle this impulse to use the drug anymore, so I can't control it anymore, and I start using the drug again. And this is, the learning model of drug use. And another influential theory which is embedded in the Volko stuff is the dopamine hypothesis. So we know that more or less every drug increases dopamine in the reward system. This has been shown in animal studies at least. Also nicotine, which has not a directly dopaminergic effect. It doesn't target dopamine transporters or dopamine receptors, but nevertheless, in the end, dopamine is released in the nucleus accumbens. And it has also been shown that in humans with PET studies, that if I give a drug and I label structures of the reward system with radio traces, for example, then I can clearly show that the subjective feeling of a high is associated with a stronger occupancy of, for example, dopamine receptors in the striatum. So dopamine plays a very strong role. However, this dopamine hypothesis in humans has been challenged because there are PET studies showing that dopamine is released in the striatum and others not. For example, stimulants, nicotine and alcohol, but not cannabis and opioids trigger, at least in measurable dopamine responses in the human ventral striatum. So likely also other neurotransmitters are needed to develop addiction in a way. There's also a famous glutamate hypothesis now, which is getting more and more influential. So we are getting a bit away from seeing addiction only as a dopaminergic problem. So what can you do if somebody has developed a substance use disorder? And first of all, we have to see that all substance use disorders are chronic, relapsing disorders. Yeah, cure is hard to achieve in these disorders. Yeah, that it's normal that people with severe substance use disorders, at least, experience relapses. Yeah, you shouldn't be disappointed if somebody is in therapy and then comes, okay, I have used the drug again. That's in a way normal. So the goal of a therapy of a substance use disorder is, the first goal is ensuring survival, because many drugs are life-threatening, for example, opioids. And the first goal is, how can we achieve that this person survives the next weeks or months? Then you start to treat secondary or concomitant diseases. You try to increase the quality of life, also the social quality of life with these peoples. You try to increase the insight of the disease and the motivation of change, because many people who are starting a drug use therapy are not that motivated, because the partner or the family says, okay, you are now going to a therapy because otherwise we get a problem with you. The motivation is often not that high, and the therapist has to start to increase this motivation. Then you can start to establish more and more substance-free phases to improve the psychosocial situation, so to solve, for example, social problems with the patient. And the final goal is, in the end, abstinence. But this is really the latest goal. So the backbone of each therapy is psychotherapy, because for most of the drug there is no pharmacotherapy so far. There are no approved substances. There are some substances are given off-label, but for most of the substances, approved medication is not available yet. Then social reintegration plays a big role, and also harm reduction. So what can I do that the patient does not affect their own health as much as possible, or as less as possible, besser gesagt. Yeah, in the end, we have 5 minutes left. There is a big debate also in Switzerland at the moment about legalization of drug use. And this is an example for cannabis legalization in the world. So the orange or red colored countries, they have already legalized. Actually, North Korea is lacking here. North Korea has no rule on cannabis consumption. And in the green countries, medical cannabis use is allowed. And this is also true, for example, in Switzerland. In the US, the situation is a bit complicated at the moment. There are states who already have legalized the drug. Some have only legalized the medical drug use, and there are still some states which have not legalized the drug. Interestingly, in the last Monitoring the Future study, this is a very, very big longitudinal study in the United States, or a daily study. It's not an age cohort. And they showed in a press release some month ago that drug use, or the cannabis use, has reached an all-time high in the last year in the US, specifically in young adults. And the authors of this research report made mainly the legalization of cannabis responsible for that effect. There is also a recent systematic review of Isorna et al. And he nicely summarizes what we know about the after effects of legalization in Canada and in the US. And what they conclude is, so we know that legalization leads to a decrease in the price of the substance, in a higher exposition of THC. This is only true for states or regions where also edibles are allowed. So edibles are, for example, THC containing fluids which can be vaped. There are states only legalizing grass, so weed, the plant itself, but not allowing, for example, food with THC. But where these edibles are allowed, so the famous THC Gummibärchen, which are existing, there the people are more exposed to higher levels of, or they're exposed to higher levels of THC. Then there's a greater diversity of presentations for consumption, like vaping and ingesting, in a way, THC containing products. There is, in fact, a lower risk perception and an increase in consumption in adults and adolescents. Interestingly, even if it's still illegal for the adolescents, the consumption has increased. And there's an increase in adverse consequences derived from cannabis consumption on public health. And one is, for example, an increase in traffic accidents associated with cannabis use. One positive side is that there is a decrease in drug-related arrests. But interestingly, in most of the states, the black market still exists. That is always the hope in legalization, that they think, okay, the black market induces so much problems, and with legalization these problems diminish. That's obviously not true, at least not yet. There was so far no increase in the demand for treatment for cannabis use disorder, for example, but there is at least one study showing that the number of cannabis use disorders has risen in one state. But I think we have to, because it takes years to develop this kind of disorder, it's likely too early to really conclude on that. So these authors at least concluded that these legislative changes have so far failed to achieve most of the main objectives. So like suppressing the illegal market and to protect the most vulnerable groups like the adolescents. But they also admit that it's likely too early to finally conclude on this problem. Yeah, I already said traffic car crashes with injury, also fatal crash rates have increased about 4 to 5 or 4 to 6% in several states. That was my presentation so far. If you are seeking help, if you recommend somebody who might develop a problem, these are some websites who can guide you to find the right institution or the right person that might help you. Also, drug checking is important because the drugs on the street are not pure. Yeah, there is some pose some risks, and we have a well-working drug checking also here in Zurich, the DITS, the Drug Information Center. And there are also substance warnings for substances, or for example, ecstasy pills with very high doses of MDMA or drugs included that shouldn't be included. So just for your information, you can use these links. Thank you for your information. And yeah, now 1 hour is over, but I think we have still some time for questions, I think.